And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
Indeed it is. Today is Friday the 13th to be exact. And, in honor of our mascot, Greta, who hates all things fossil fueled, we have this wonderful little picture. You've seen the how dare you that she's been noted with everywhere. Well, imagine this. Pilots are now taking it up. We've got this fantastic photo here of what? When you load jet fuel. How dare you? That is going to be on her gravestone, I'm pretty sure. Anyway. Welcome to Climate Change Roundtable. We appreciate you being here. And guess what? YouTube has allowed us to stream. Yes, after last week, just minutes before the broadcast, putting up a denial on us and preventing us from streaming Dr. Judith Curry live, we are now able to stream on YouTube. Interesting thing that happened, though, because after YouTube put a ban on us, all of a sudden, our channel became incredibly interesting to a lot of people. And guess what? On Rumble, we got over 150,000 views of that video with Dr. Judith Curry, whereas we may not have gotten anywhere close to that had YouTube not banned us. So thanks, YouTube. We appreciate it. All right, let's meet our people that are here today. We've got Linnea Lueken, who is our specialist on everything fossil fuel. She actually worked in the oil industry as an expert in drilling and all that sort of stuff. We have Sterling Burnett, Dr. Sterling Burnett to be precise, who has been he's been the leader of the Robinson Center for Climate Change at the Heartland Institute for a couple of years now. And we have Steve Milloy of junkscience.com, who has been debunking junk longer than any of us, as far as I know. And he's got a fantastic take on a lot of different things about climate. And so we want to go to our first topic right away. And by the way, don't forget, you can comment over on the YouTube stream. You can add comments. And if you have questions for us, we will, in fact, try to answer them, provided that those answers are sensible and polite, or those questions, rather. Anyway, so Steve, welcome today. I want to talk about the whole Exxon Knew thing. A little bit of background. A bunch of people got together several years ago and had a secret meeting. And this included Bill McKibben and Naomi Oreskes and some of these other folks that are climate zealots, got together and decided they were going to figure out how much Exxon knew about climate change back in the 70s. And their whole spiel was, well, Exxon knew about it, yet they continued to produce fossil fuels, and therefore they're evil and must be stopped. That's their whole viewpoint on it. But something interesting happened this week. A peer-reviewed paper was published about it. Steve, why don't you tell us about it?
Well, so Naomi Oreskes and a couple other of her compatriots who are associated with law firms suing Exxon or at Harvard University, which is funded by leftist climate foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, which funded the study. And supposedly they went through Exxon documents from the 70s to the early 2000s and concluded that Exxon really knew about climate and had predicted climate just as it's happening. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Exxon's modeling was as incorrect, or was slightly less incorrect than the average climate model today, but still way over predicted warming. And then of course, Exxon doesn't even go to the cause of the warming, which I think is the real point that kind of needs to be emphasized here. We have just been through the last 8 years, and this week we've seen headlines about how these are the hottest 8 years in history. But I have a different take on this. If you look at the last 8 years, there's, according to the NOAA data that was released yesterday, there's actually been some cooling, and this is despite 14% of greenhouse gas or CO2 being man-made CO2 being emitted and captured in the atmosphere. So where is the warming? And Exxon never really addressed the cause of the warming. They just assumed that it was CO2 warming. No doubt that's why they overpredicted warming, as does all the climate activists and alarmists and their models. And I think that maybe if we have time, we could get into a discussion of what might actually be happening with climate.
Interestingly enough, and Andy, I want to go to our link at What's Up With That. Now, the elephant in the room is the fact that these Exxon scientists back in the 70s actually did a better job of predicting the climate in the future when they just, they were newbies to all of this stuff. They did a better job than the IPCC and a better job than James Hansen. And yet, that's the real elephant in the room that all of the headlines today are missing. They don't like to talk about that, right? So Steve, you had your post up the other day talking about this. What do you think is going to be the impact of this whole thing now that it's out in the open? The fact that Exxon did a better job than climate scientists.
Yeah, well, I think what they're trying to do is they want to use this for litigation purposes. There are all these local and state lawsuits, and they're desperately trying to show that Exxon knew something special that nobody else knew. Even though Thomas Jefferson wrote about climate change in the 18th century, moving a little closer to our 1965, there was a commission that warned Lyndon Johnson about climate change. And then we had Paul Ehrlich, he talked about global warming and the population bomb. And, to lay all this on Exxon, like they knew something special, well, that's just not true. Exxon has been guessing at climate like everybody else has, and all these guesses have been wrong.
Yeah. Why do you think that they went after Exxon specifically as opposed to like Shell or Gulf?
Well, Exxon is, the most successful oil company ever. And if you can take down the biggest company and the wealthiest company, then everybody else is just going to fall in line.
I see. It's interesting. Exxon, if I remember correctly, came from a company called Esso, ESSO, and they sort of merged in. And then there was Humble Oil, and it sort of like grew and grew and grew. And their slogan back then, if I remember correctly, was "Put a tiger in your tank." Right. Well, now with the publication of this thing, I think they should change the slogan to "Put a denier in your tank."
Well, I don't know where they're going to go with this. I mean, it's great headlines for the other side, but I really don't understand because Exxon wasn't right; they were wrong. And I think that now that free speech has kind of been restored to the world, at least in Twitter, we can have these discussions now as to what is really behind the warming trend we think has been happening for a while. So I think that the alarmists are becoming less and less important. This hottest year stuff is fading. People are becoming more weary and cynical about it. So I'm looking forward to the future and the future of climate denial, if you were.
All righty. So let's go to our panelists and see what they have to say about it. Sterling, you're up.
Yeah, I've got sort of a similar but different take than Steve. Exxon can't know something that's not known, that humans are causing climate change. Exxon can't know that because nobody knows that. Right. They assume it based on climate models, which even Exxon's own models fail to match reality. Secondly, this isn't some new revelation. It's just a new packaging of things they've been claiming in these lawsuits for years, which is that some Exxon scientists, not all of them, some Exxon scientists, a rump group, came to the conclusion that that CO2 emissions were affecting climate. But you know what? Exxon is not a scientific body, and they went with the majority of their scientists that didn't come to this conclusion and weren't worried about warming as a business can do, and they went on making a product that was legal. So even if they'd been dead right, about it, and they weren't, their job is not to follow the science. Their job is to make money for their stockholders. And that's what they continue to do. And in doing so, and they did so by providing goods and services that all of us used daily. So I think this gives them no foothold. It's just packaging something that we've known for a couple of years now, that some scientists at Exxon worried about climate change, but the company as a whole said, we're a business and we got more important matters to worry about. We're not the National Academy of Sciences.
Linnea, you worked in the oil industry for a while. When this whole Exxon Knew thing came about, what did the folks that work in that industry have to say about it?
Well, I think I was still in like high school or earlier when the
Oh, okay.
came out. So it's probably not something I can very well comment on. But I will say that to the people watching, this stuff isn't new at all. I mean, the alarmist side uses lawfare as much as they possibly can, whether or not they're going to win the case. Just getting them on the books is enough to waste everyone's time and money and bring attention and publicity to the issue. And that's, I think, part of the main goal is it doesn't really matter whether or not they win suits against Exxon and this point. The point is the headlines that are generated by it. The point is the tagline Exxon Knew. That's the point. To these people, I mean, and to the layperson who doesn't have time to do deep research on every single thing that they see to determine whether or not it's accurate, all they'll see is Exxon scientists, right there, Exxon scientists predicted global warming. And so now you have constructed kind of a legal narrative of a fossil fuel industry conspiracy to hide the truth about their product. And it's pretty successful to the layperson, I would say, unfortunately. So what we need to do is try to promote the actual facts as much as we can. And that's pretty much all we can do. And just hope that, the judges and juries that might be involved in this don't kind of get swayed by the publicity element of it.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, in the whole process with this, they tried to use the same tactics that they used against big tobacco with Exxon. And in fact, they were making direct comparison, and now even today, they're going down the path of trying to equate any fossil fuel use with bad health like they did with tobacco. This week, we've had this gas ban thing come up, which is absolutely stunningly idiotic. They're basically saying gas stoves inside of a building, a house, a restaurant, or whatever, are harming people, specifically harming children. And they cited this study. Steve, you did some work on this, where they basically, the study was nothing but fluff, right?
Yeah, for sure. And before I get to that, just let me put a cross the T on the Exxon stuff. Right before this roundtable, I was on the phone with Exxon. I filed shareholder proposals with Exxon on climate, trying to get them to tell the truth. And, it's not Exxon Knew, it's Exxon believes. I was on the phone with their top climate guy. These guys, they drank the Kool-Aid, they believe it. And when, people accuse us of being Exxon funded, no. Exxon is funding the other side. Anyway, so to the gas stove story, so New York and California are trying to ban gas stoves in new homes. The Biden administration, I guess, wanted to try this on a national level through the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So they cooked up this study that was published in December. And the bottom line of the study was they concluded that gas stoves in homes are associated with 13% of childhood asthma. Of course, this is total nonsense. In addition to the awful epidemiology, which I don't want to bore people with, the bottom line is that asthma is an allergic disease. To have an allergic response, you must be exposed to an allergen, and an allergen is a protein like pollen or mold or pet dander or something like that. There is no sort of protein or allergen that is emitted when you burn any type of fossil fuels any place. You may get some carbon dioxide, some carbon monoxide, but you're not going to get any allergens. So it's not possible to cause asthma in children with gas stoves. And you may have air quality problems if you have poor ventilation, but that would go for an electric stove as well. So this whole notion that 13% of childhood asthma is caused by gas stoves is just totally bogus, because there's nothing that comes out that is an allergen to cause the asthma.
Even the air quality problems are nonsense, because it's not from the stove, it's from what you cook on the stove, right? It's from the pan, whatever the chemicals on the pan, and the food themselves. That's what you want the venting for. Nothing comes from natural gas. And the natural gas chemicals, the main chemical is water vapor. And if your kid's allergic to water, you've got bigger problems than your stovetop. Basically, this is just one more effort to force people to electrify everything at a time when they're busy destroying the electric grid. So they're going to leave us with nothing, shivering in the dark when the power grid fails.
So what I thought was really interesting about this, and I've only seen this one or two other times in the history of junk science, and I've been doing this for 30 years. You know, there was just an immediate reaction against this. I mean, people didn't even want to consider whether gas stoves were actually connected with child. They love their gas stoves so much. The only time I've ever seen the public like totally reject, media hysteria is with cell phones. You know, and there was 20 years ago, there was the scare about cell phones causing brain cancer, but people love their cell phones so much. They don't, I mean, that was junk science too, but usually a lot of times people fall for the scares, but with cell phones, no. Gas stoves, no. So I think it's remarkable.
There was a whole cottage industry that developed around cell phone radiation shields, that you could buy to put next to your head to keep that dangerous radiation from getting to you. It was just absurd.
Another example of that, if I could say, is in policy. You may remember a few years ago, I believe it was under Clinton, they tried to add some drug costs to Medicare. And within 2 weeks of passing a law that added these drug costs, Congress had to come back in session and rescind that law because there was such a backlash. That's what the backlash to this gas stove thing has been like.
Yeah, there's quite a backlash developing over the gas stove issue. That these fossil fuels, the natural gas is a danger to people. Well, it just isn't. But interestingly enough, the hypocrisy associated with this is rampant. One of the most circulated pictures on the internet over the last couple of days has been this picture of Joe Biden. Yes, the First Lady cooking with gas. There she is.
Well,
and the other one was AOC. AOC put out a statement on Twitter that says, gas stoves cause brain damage. And then there was a picture of her cooking on her gas stove. Well, there you go.
Well, maybe it does.
I was about to say, maybe that explains some of the problems that Biden has when he speaks. And, gosh, maybe they have a point after all.
That is interesting, though, to note that, they claim that their concern, part of their concern with the gas stove situation is like a PM 2.5 type of issue, or any of the other number of gases that might be related to cooking on the stove with gas. And I'm thinking about this as I'm smoking up my kitchen with my electric stovetop last night. I threw butter into too hot of a pan and just my entire kitchen got overwhelmed with smoke. And I was like, I wonder if EPA thinks about this as something that could be a problem with asthma kids and stuff. And what are they going to do? Are they going to ban cooking indoors because they're so worried about PM 2.5? No, this is all about gas use. Period. They want to stop the fossil fuel use. They do not care about the alleged health effects, because if they did, there's all sorts of crazy lengths that they could take that one.
Yeah. Well, the reality with asthma is that over the past 30 years, as the air has gotten cleaner, asthma rates have gone up. And so, why is that? Is that gas stoves? Well, no, because there's no allergen to gas stoves. There's been, I think I wrote about this a long time ago. There's been a lot of confusion as to, like, a lot of diagnostic problems as to what is asthma and what's not. A lot of bronchitis gets erroneously classified in doctors' offices as asthma for whatever reason. So we really don't know what's going on with childhood asthma. There are many causes. If your child has asthma, it could be a genetic thing, but it could be a pet. It could be mold. It could be, in some sort of insect protein. I mean, there's lots of things that can cause asthma, but it's not gas stoves.
Yeah. And it's just amazing what they've been going through. Sterling, you've got something to add?
Yeah, one last thing. So another thing that's happened in the last 20 years or the last few decades that might be increasing incidence of asthma or bronchitis, things like that, is that we've actually insulated our homes much better. So we're recirculating dirty air over and over and over again. It's not cycling through, being blown in and out. But what's interesting in all these cities that have started, because they started in the cities, the gas thing started in the cities. All these cities that have done this, they interestingly have exemptions for industry. Oh, industry still needs gas. So, okay, we're going to exempt them. And for commercial restaurants, because they don't want Gordon Ramsay and Wolfgang Puck moving out of state. I've seen many cooking shows. I don't see any of them cooking on electric stoves. So evidently for the elites, it's okay for them to still have gas. For businesses, it's okay for them. But for you poor folks who we claim are suffering greater incidences of health problems, you can't have gas.
Yeah,
it's just hypocrisy, like you said, Anthony.
Yeah. So let's wrap that up and move on to our next topic by saying, finishing up on the stoves and the fossil fuels and Exxon Knew, by saying that, you know, the favorite line of people saying that you're really getting there, now you're cooking with gas, should be changed to now you're cooking with fossil fuels. And watch people get upset about that one. Okay. So we've got our next topic, which is climate fact check for 2022. Steve put together a fantastic collage of media claims and then the debunking of it as a post. And it's just very thorough and very interesting. And we want to talk about that. We want to get that website up, and so we can show you as we're going through the different topics. But Steve, what prompted you to do this?
Well, there are so many of these, bogus links between climate and natural disasters made every day. I mean, the climate propaganda machine just anytime there's bad weather, they link it with climate, and then they say it another 1,000 times. And then, considering that there's bad weather all the time and they repeat everything. I mean, we're just constantly bombarded with this stuff, and there's got to be a way to keep track of this. So I think I'm going to try to keep track of this on a more regular basis, and, maybe do some sort of, more periodic climate fact check. So I just, at the end of the year, we decided to do one for 2022, and we came up with 9 commonly mentioned natural disasters that were linked by mainstream media to climate.
So out of all of the different claims the media made in 2022 about climate change, what do you think was the most egregious?
Well, the one I see the most is the floods in Pakistan, but that's not really my favorite. So as far as the floods in Pakistan, look, Pakistan has monsoon seasons.
Pakistan has monsoons? Who thought?
Unbelievable. And then, but the thing that was most interesting to me was that, and I actually read about this in the New York Times. It actually does help to read what they write, even though most of it is stupid. Sometimes they have gems. So there was some Indian researcher in there who had done research on monsoon, showing that monsoon rains in the India-Pakistan region had actually been declining since the 1950s. So to blame, 1 year's heavy monsoons on global warming is just, it's absurd. But that's a common one I see. But my favorite of the year is the World Cup, the one on World Cup skiing. This was an article that was in the Washington Post, I think, in November, and people were complaining about not being able to ski, or the World Cup skiing season couldn't start in October. Well, when World Cup skiing started in the 1960s, the season started in January when there's a lot of snow. But over the years, for whatever reason, they've been able to move it up to October. But all of a sudden, this October, there was no snow, and they're all upset. That must be global warming.
Yeah, so here we have the World Cup skiing up here on the screen. The Washington Post, they're always accurate, blared a headline in November saying shorter winters are blamed for it being cold enough to hold only 1 of 8 races in mid-November, blah, blah, blah. And of course, in the same breath, WAPO will blame, more snow or more rain on climate change. It's become the universal boogeyman. Anything that seems to be slightly out of the normal. Climate change. That's it. That's it, folks. That's the only answer. There's no thought or research or background checks or anything that even the most prominent newspapers like WAPO or the New York Times do. It's just asinine. So let's go to our panel. What do you think about this? Linnea?
Sure. Well, I mean, what can you say? Pretty much everything is climate change. The leak. I cannot talk today. The Lake Mead stuff and many of the other, water reservoirs in California, they were complaining and whining and moaning all summer about the drought and about how water levels are declining, which, of course, as more population grows in those areas in the desert, which normally no one could live in those kind of regions, and you get more and more people, more and more, golf courses. I think Disney is looking at putting a big water park near the Palm Springs area or some kind of a resort or something, because that's not going to have an impact on their water table. But of course, they'll get the permit for it. But the idea that the only thing that could possibly be happening, that their water reserves are lower, is climate change, and it has nothing at all to do with the population increase, is crazy. And now they're all complaining that they have too much water. What do you guys want? There's all sorts of flooding. Maybe if you guys were building more reservoirs instead of banning building new ones, you would have somewhere to put all the excess water you get every year in the rainy season.
Or alternatively, if you were shoring up the dams and reservoirs you already had so they don't break, and if you weren't making water flow straight to the oceans to protect endangered species and rather capturing some of it, which they're doing, you'd have water. Now, they are going to have some water. It's not just the rainfall, but the snowpack, and it's likely the lake levels are already coming up. Will they come up more? Yeah, they will, because snowpack will melt. I thought that was a good story. I thought the hurricane story was great, right? Because we had a below average hurricane season, but Ian is indicative of worsening hurricanes. One hurricane is indicative of worsening hurricanes due to climate change. I just like to make a pitch here. Steve, you talked about doing this more periodically, these fact checks. Of course, on Climate Realism, we do fact checks every day. We certainly talked about Pakistan when it happened. We talked about Hurricane Ian and the whole season. I got to admit, we didn't cover the ski story. I like that. I like that. But, almost every one of the topics you covered at the year end, because they were, heavily covered, we covered at one time or another on Climate Realism. So that'd be a source for you there.
No, Sterling, you guys, Climate Realism is fantastic. I go there all the time. And this is really sort of a way to compile it for folks in the media, at least, people interested in, different perspectives. Another one of my favorite stories that we're going to see again this year is the heat waves, right? The UK, it was a very hot summer. In Europe, it was the hottest summer in Europe, according to, all the propaganda. We would be amiss if we didn't address this. Of course, there's no evidence that heat waves have anything to do with emissions. Heat waves, for example, in the U.S., where we have certain data, heat waves have dramatically declined in intensity and frequency over the past 90 or so years. Even people like Cliff Mass, who otherwise subscribes to climate idiocy, but has debunked this notion that the slight global warming we're seeing has anything to do with heat waves. I think, as he puts it, 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming does not cause 20 to 30 degrees of heat wave. So and anytime it's hot, we hear about this. But so with the UK, a lot of the times this summer I spent, I hear about these record temperatures in the UK, but then I would go back to, there's a great site at the University of Maine. They have it's called their Climate Reanalyzer, and they have what they present as the current global temperature. And the global temperature all summer was pretty consistent, about somewhere between -1 C to about 0.3 C, warming over the 1979 to 2000 average. So while it was really hot in the UK, it it was cooler elsewhere, and overall not much global warming at all.
You know, that's similar to what's going on now. They keep talking about headlines almost every day, talking about the UK heat, not the UK, the Central Europe heat wave. They don't say it's Central Europe or Southern Europe, you know, Italy, Spain as well. But a lot of it is not getting snow, and they're pretty warm. And that's a, you know, that's not a small area, but relative to what's going on, it is a pretty small area, because while Central Europe is warmer than average, much of Northern Europe, Scandinavian countries, and certainly the entirety of Russia, the Ukraine, former Soviet bloc, Mongolia, China, a little country called China, Japan, much cooler than average. They're getting record cold and snowstorms, and no one's reporting on that.
Yeah.
Right.
This week in the New York Times, they had a story on how there's not much snow at Davos. But if you just go back 4 years in the New York Times, they had a story about how Davos got 6 feet of snow in 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
What this has to do with emissions is beyond me.
Yeah, Linnea touched on this, and the lack of looking into the past is one of the biggest failures associated with climate change. I want to point out, you know, Linnea said that they're now complaining about having too much water in California. And of course, there's stories coming out now that the atmospheric river in California and the West Coast is caused by climate change. Well, that is absolute bunk. If you go look at the history of things in California, the Great Flood of 1862 was a period of 43 days of continuous rain and snow, and it flooded in Sacramento. Here's a lithograph of what it looked like in downtown Sacramento then. It completely flooded. Much of the Sacramento Valley and part of the San Joaquin Valley completely flooded. And this is not anything unique, because the Indians of the area pointed out in their stories about, you know, the tribal history of the past, that it was very common for the whole Sacramento Valley to become an inland sea under certain weather conditions. And yet the media immediately jumps on it's climate change. Well, the biggest flood ever, which killed about 4,000 people back then, happened in 1861 and 1862, before they were driving SUVs, before coal-fired power plants or natural gas cooking stoves. All that stuff happened well before climate was even a glimmer in the eye of science. And yet they're immediately jumping on this, and that's how irresponsible the media is at reporting on climate science. All right, I want to go to our next topic. We've done so far Exxon Knew, climate fact check, and now we're on to the biggest monster of all, WOTUS, the monster named WOTUS. For those of you who don't know who or what WOTUS is, no, it's not a relative of Godzilla, although it does tend to stomp on people. And the Waters of the United States Act from the EPA is the most draconian piece of legislation, well, not legislation, but of bureaucracy ever. Basically saying that if you happen to have some land and you have a pond or maybe some puddles or vernal pools, well, the EPA is going to run in and save those little microscopic critters from your nasty things that you're going to do with those pieces of water. Steve has written extensively about it, and Sterling has talked extensively about it. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys, and you guys can talk about the giant monster named WOTUS.
Well, you know, maybe while we're talking about it, Andy can do some quick internet research and pull up the Agenda 21 map for the United States. I think if you Google that, you'll find it. So WOTUS is all about taking land out of development. And this is something that Greens have been wanting to do since they got together as Greens. And the map that I hope Andy can find shows what their vision for in the United States is. But find the map. It's a yellow and red map. And they basically put the entire U.S. off limits to development.
Just click images, Andy. I'm sure it's in there.
Yeah, there you go.
There
right.
it is.
Okay. So all this yellow and red and orange, this is all areas of the United States that will be off limits to development or tightly controlled by the government. And when this map was produced by opponents of Agenda 21 in the 1980s, Congress's interest in taking more land out of circulation immediately evaporated. And so this map has kind of gone away. But WOTUS, Waters of the United States, is a provision under the Clean Water Act that allows EPA to basically take land out of circulation or prevent development if it thinks that water on the land is somehow connected to the water table, which is connected to a navigable river. EPA is only supposed to be able to regulate water around navigable rivers, but EPA has interpreted its Clean Water Act powers as being able to regulate anything that is connected to the water table, which is connected to the navigable river. So conceivably, drainage ditches and mud puddles under EPA's interpretation are subject to EPA regulation. So if you buy a piece of land that maybe gets heavy rains once in a while, and EPA can connect the mud puddle to the water table to a nearby navigable body of water, well, EPA can stop you from developing that.
It's worse than that, Steve. It's not. It's worse than that. It's so much worse because it doesn't have to be connected to the water table. The way EPA wrote the rules was, if there's no flow to navigable waters, but because your land is soggy enough part of the year that certain plants grow on it, that would be associated with navigable waters. So like you get some cattails growing in your backyard because you've got a soggy bottom where it holds water. And so some cattails grow up. That's navigable now. That's covered by Waters of the United States. And the problem is none of that's in the Clean Air Act. Wetlands, you will not find the word wetlands in the Clean Air Act.
Clean Water Act.
The Clean Water Act, right. You won't find wetlands in the Clean Water Act. What the Clean Water Act was meant to keep ports and navigable rivers clear. It's not the Safe Drinking Water Act, a different thing. And over time, through mission creep, the EPA has largely expanded to every little water, every little puddle. And the Supreme Court started stepping in and modestly reining them in, saying, look, there was something called the glancing goose test. Just because a goose might look down and see something they want to land on your land doesn't make it navigable water. So under Obama, because it used to be navigable waters of the United States, he changed it. Oh no, we're just going to drop. This is how we solve the Supreme Court problem. We're just going to drop navigable. So the Clean Water Act has nothing whatsoever to do with the new rules. It's going to be any water. Now, I'm sorry, the courts have stepped in again multiple times and reined them in. And every time the EPA comes back, they said, oh, well, we've learned our lesson. We've learned our lesson. We're going to write a rule that satisfies the Supreme Court. And then they write a new rule that's just as expansive or more expansive than the rule that was struck down. Yeah. Now, under Biden, Obama wrote the first WOTUS rule, the one that just jettisoned navigable altogether. And the court said no. Lower courts said no. We've actually read the Supreme Court's ruling, and you can't do it. So we had no rule until Trump came along. He wrote a new rule that attempted to give landowners some certainty as to how they develop their property, when they have to get permits, things like that. Courts stepped in and blocked that one as well. And Biden has now said, oh, we're not going to go back to that nasty old WOTUS rule that Obama wrote. We're going to go back to what was before Obama, which had been struck down by courts. That's why they were writing a new rule. And then we're going to just expand it a little bit. So they're going back to an old rule that failed to satisfy the Supreme Court. And they're making it, once again, stronger, covering more land, giving less certainty. And they say, oh, but we're exempting all these people. But you won't really know you're exempt until you come to us and see if you can get a permit from us.
Right. And that's an important point. Enforcement of this is rather arbitrary, and it's very expensive and time consuming. There's a family, a husband, wife, Sackett's. They've been at the Supreme Court before on wetlands, and they actually defeated EPA 9-0. But guess what? They're back in the Supreme Court this term over the same piece of property. And I don't know many people that can afford lawyers for 20 years. Over developing a small parcel of property. The whole thing is just crazy. It's all about giving EPA arbitrary power to take land out of development.
What was their property? They wanted to put a home on property. It wasn't an industrial complex. They wanted to build a home on property they bought to buy a home. The locals said, yes, you're zoned for homes. Build your home. It was hundreds of yards away from the nearest navigable body of water. But the EPA said, no, we think that your water could flow from your property across every intervening property between here and there, all that have been developed, by the way, and pollute the waters. So we've got you covered. You got to get a permit.
Yeah, I have some personal experience with this kind of thing associated with what they call vernal pools in California that happen during the spring. Right now, California has vernal pools all over the place because of all the rain. But interestingly enough, back around the year 2000, 1998 to 2000, there was a new high school trying to be built in Chico, California. And the environmentalists, being absolutely no growth unless we say so, decided they were going to stop it. And they came up with a way to do it. And what they did was they found this plant. It was called meadow foam. And they found a variation of it that had kind of branched off from the main, the main branch of the whole plant taxonomy and all that stuff. But basically, it was one particular piece of plant that was going to go extinct anyway because it became homozygotic, meaning it was self-pollinating and it didn't have any biological diversity. And it was in the few ponds or puddles, vernal pools around Chico, California, particularly where the new high school was going to be built. And so they came up with, they got this thing red listed. They got this thing, listed as endangered, and they set aside, they made the city set aside a meadow foam preserve. They fenced it in, in this one area. Interestingly enough, that used to be grazed by cattle, right? It was out in the middle of a big cow field, but they fenced in this meadow foam, and they used that as a way to stop the high school from being built on this ecologically sensitive land that's a cow field with this meadow foam in it. Well, they did succeed in stopping the high school, but years later, now almost 20 years later, that ecological preserve of meadow foam that these environmentalists insisted on, that had been fenced in and no longer grazed by cattle, is overgrown. All kinds of invasive weeds and so forth. And guess what? There ain't no meadow foam in it anymore. It's dead because it's been taken over by the invasive plants. That's how these folks work.
The first thing I thought of when I was reading the new rules and the exceptions that they have to it, I'm reading these and they make an exception for rice. So thanks, guys. We can still have rice patties. But then I got to thinking, but they don't say anything about sugarcane. And they don't say anything about the fact that I just moved from Louisiana back in August. I'm thinking half of the state of Louisiana is permanently soaked. Like that, the entire part of southern Louisiana, that entire region is nothing but a slightly underground interconnected body of water, basically. If we weren't constantly intervening with the Army Corps of Engineers and, piling dirt up everywhere all the time, every time we build a new housing development down there, everyone is underwater constantly. And the place I just moved from, my neighborhood had, you had a more or less dry yard, but there were these little mounds, these little holes, it looks like a mud sandcastle everywhere around your yard because crawfish were able to permanently live on your property because it was wet enough underground. And I'm like, does this mean that you can't develop in those areas anymore because it's a permanent wetland, basically?
Let's be honest.
Yeah, Sterling.
Well, let's be honest. You couldn't develop a cemetery in Louisiana 100 years ago if that was the standard, right? They don't bury people underground in New Orleans.
No,
There's
you
a reason
don't.
why they're all mausoleums above ground. And
it's the coolest thing you've ever seen.
It is.
They're
cemeteries.
They're
Great
really
cemeteries,
neat.
but the point is, it's because the water table is so high. So what they're saying is you can't develop cemeteries anymore. You can't develop anything.
Well, during hurricanes, those cemeteries become what's known as floatus.
Right.
If you guys read the New York Times, they've had a couple articles recently about how they don't want you to be buried anymore. They want you to be your body composted.
Yeah. So. They want you to be eaten. They want you to become part of the food chain. Soylent Green is real, folks. Yeah. it's really discouraging when you read about this WOTUS stuff and how extensive it would be, what the restrictions would be. It's not just. I read the Clean Water Act, and the power they get through the Clean Water Act is the power of interstate commerce. It's to keep interstate, to keep rivers and ports clean and clear for commerce. I would argue, if you read the Constitution, gosh, imagine that, people actually following the law that founded the country, that the federal government has no role in any navigable water that doesn't cross state lines, unless they constructed it. Army Corps builds a lot of reservoirs. Okay, so maybe they've got some say there, though they usually turn it over to locals. But if you got a stock pond, they never should have had any power over that, even if you could float a boat in it, because it was not in interstate commerce. It did not cross borders. And if the water body does not cross borders, I don't care how many connections there are to navigable water. If they don't cross borders, the federal government has no role in that. That's why we have federalism in the Constitution.
Well, Sterling, all our environmental laws were written 40 and 50 years ago, when the environment was completely different, and people just basically said, okay, clean up everything. And over that time, activists they're the ones that wrote the laws to start with, so they knew what they were doing. And EPA has absolutely run wild with its authority. Judges don't know anything about the environment, believe everything activists say. What we really need is for Congress to revisit all these laws, which of course I know is going to be impossible because of the partisan divide we have in the country. But if you're really interested in protecting the environment, then we need to update the laws so that they make sense, and allow for economic development. There's a whole lot of science we have learned since the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and all the other environmental laws that have been passed by Congress. And we need to incorporate that into environmental protection, and we're not doing that.
All righty. So we've tackled the issues, the Exxon Knew, the worst climate stories in the media of 2022 with Climate Fact Check, and now the big monster, WOTUS. And so we're open to questions for any of you that might have them. Feel free to post them on any of our comments section, the video feeds, and we'll try to answer them the best we can. But while we're waiting for those to come up, any of you guys got any further comments on any of the topics that we've covered today?
I'd like to see South Park tackle WOTUS, because there'd this be this huge monster, wet monster coming from the ground, taking everyone's land. And I want to go back to something you pointed out. You've written about this 1862 flood multiple times. Not only did it occur when there were no cars, no power plants, no substantial fossil fuel use except for burning trees and coal. They occurred when there were no impervious surfaces. There wasn't concrete anywhere. They hadn't channelized all these streams. They hadn't destroyed all the wetlands that soaked up, or developed all the wetlands that soaked up water. So all this flooding occurred before a human had any impact on the environment, and exacerbated. I mean, let's face it, part of the reason the flooding is so bad now is not just that the rainfall, these aren't vernal pools now, these are vernal oceans. It is not just because the rainfalls come down so fast and so heavy, but it's because it's falling on roads, concrete roads, ditches that are lined with concrete that don't soak into the ground.
Right. It's called impermeable surfaces. And because there's so much more impermeable surface in the United States than there used to be 100 years ago, flash flooding is worse, street flooding is worse, all this stuff, because a lot of the ground is covered up where the water can't percolate into it anymore. And so, interestingly enough, the big flood of 1862 in California prompted the creation of all kinds of dams and dikes and levees throughout California, which you may recall back around the year 1998 when we had the massive super El Nino and California got hit with atmospheric rivers. We had a lot of flooding in the Sacramento Valley because these dams and these levees that they put together, for the Sacramento Delta, they couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle the flow. They didn't build them well enough. And so you had flooding anyway. The point is, Mother Nature is going to do what she's going to do. And if she chooses to squish us like a bug, she will do it without even looking back. So we've got some questions here that we want to put up. First one is, it's for me. It says here, Anthony, you showed us how bad the surface stations are in the United States. Have you checked out any other countries? I hear China is especially bad. Well, actually, I have been to China, and I did look at a meteorological station in China in the city of Shenzhen, which is one of the big manufacturing hubs not too far from Hong Kong. And in fact, they actually had a pretty well put together meteorological station there, but that's only because that city is relatively new. Shenzhen in Chinese actually means the drains, and it used to be wetlands. But does China care? No, their 30-year plan was, let's pave this over and make an industrial city. And that's exactly what they did, not giving a hoot about wetlands whatsoever. And they built a new weather station there. Of course, it's in the middle of the city. It's surrounded by all kinds of UHI, but it was reasonably well sited and well put together. As far as the rest of China goes, I'd say it probably goes a lot like what's been happening in the past few years. There's a disparity of wealth and economy in China. We've got some very, very rich people that drive Mercedes down the roads. At the same time, you've got people riding bicycles with hay and animals stacked on the back of their bike and motorcycle and mopeds and things like that. And so I would suspect that the poorer areas of China, although I haven't been there, probably have the same kinds of problems with weather stations that we have seen throughout the United States and part of Europe.
They probably also, and I haven't been there, but they probably also have a lot less coverage in rural areas than we do, because they've got these vast areas where all that is farms or wild areas, despite their huge population. Most of it's concentrated in the cities. I would wager almost all their meteorological stations are concentrated in urban areas.
Anthony, has anyone put together a graph of like the NOAA temperatures with the uncertainties? With the uncertainties in the measurements, and NOAA has these charts going back to 1880 of global temperature. Obviously, that's silly. If you look at the coverage in 1880, it's hardly anything. We hadn't even been to the North Pole or the South Pole. I mean, it's all just guesswork. And if there was a range of uncertainty about all this, your work shows that more than 90% of temperature stations are not accurate to within a degree.
That's right.
Well, if we only had a degree of warming,
worse than that.
It's worse, yeah.
Worse than that. In the United States, the rule is for what's called the Cooperative Observer Network, which is the surface network for the United States, which there are several thousand stations. The rule that they give to all these observers is that you're supposed to round the temperature you measure for the high and low today to the nearest number. And so, if the temperature is 56.8, you're going to round it to 57. And so built into the data is a plus or minus 1 degree accuracy. And yet we have the media going out making citations where we get these publications from NASA guests and other people that produce data sets that, 2017 was the warmest year ever by 0.02 degrees. Wow. That really means something in the context of plus or minus 1 degree accuracy.
Abel Windsor has a good comment on this. Arctic weather station. He notes that since the end of the Cold War, they're not maintaining about 90% of the Arctic weather stations anymore. So, the coverage up there has become gross, and and I'll wager that the 10% that are left are near more urban, military bases that still exist, cities that are still up there. They're not in disparate locations where they might have also been tracking radar and things like that before.
Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to accept that, the planet is slightly warmer than it was 200 years ago. Of course, we've got 6 billion more people and all these urban heat islands and God knows what else, all these El Nino, God knows what's going on. What bothers me is when you see the precision that they talk about this with. They talk about like global temperature in 1880 like it's a thing, like someone was actually measuring it. There's someone, outside in space with a thermometer, and it's accurate, and it's just not.
Yeah. So we have another question here from Bill Peckney, who says, Anthony, do you see any conflict between the USCRN and USA satellite temperature history? Well, let me give some background. The USCRN stands for the U.S. Climate Reference Network, and this is something that the public never hears about. Now, back around 1998, the guy that ran the National Climatic Data Center wrote a paper saying we need to improve our climate measuring system for the United States. And so this thing called the U.S. Climate Reference Network was created. And they did this with state-of-the-art instrumentation. They did this with triple redundant temperature sensors that have what's called air aspirated shields that bring airflow up next to the sensor to shield them from the sun, and so that you don't get stagnant air collecting in the ground, and doing all kinds of other measurements. And they do this with very high accuracy, data loggers, satellite communications. These stations also, by design, were placed far away from humanity, far away from UHI, urban heat island effects, far away from asphalt and concrete like we've identified, with the majority of the surface network in the United States and part of the world. They put this together by design. So the USCRN, which you can see the plot for on my website, whatsupwiththat.com. If you go to the right sidebar, you'll see that. And we compare it with the University of Alabama Huntsville satellite record. And I will point out that there's been very little, if any, warming on the surface network in the past 15 years for which we have good data. Now, that's not an actual climate period. A period for measuring any kind of climate change as defined by the World Meteorological Organization is 30 years. So we can't actually say with certainty that the fact that the U.S. surface temperature network looks pretty flat is a climate statistic just yet, but it's getting there. Now, we have had, if you look at the UAH there on the top for global temperature, we have had a pause in the past few years. There hasn't been much of an increase in temperature. So I will say that these two products are complementary, that the satellite record and the better surface temperature record are actually, from the USCRN, are actually pretty good indicators of where we're really going. There's really not been much warming at all if you look at the U.S. surface temperature. There's a slight upward trend in the U.S. surface temperature from USCRN, but nothing like what you see being published by NASA, GESS, BEST, and these other outfits that are claiming that global warming is out of control, and here's the data. And that data is all based on the faulty surface temperature network, where you can, 90% of them are close to concrete, air conditioner outputs. We even found one up in Washington at the airport, where it was right on a fence in a parking lot for the fixed base operator airport there. And there was a car with its radiator parked right up against that sensor. This is how NOAA measures temperature. And it's not just tragic, it's ridiculous. So we got another one here. They're talking about since 1600 AD in the cold point of the Little Ice Age, the average temperature has risen 0.6 of a degree. And then it's only about 0.2 or so. That's the thing. We go back into history, you find different things. And most of the folks that are talking about climate change really don't pay any attention to history. They're only looking forward, and they're only looking forward with models. Here's one that Sterling might have a good input on, about tree stumps, 3,000-year-old tree stumps discovered in Iceland. What does that tell you?
Well, look, it's not just tree stumps in Iceland or shell middens that they find in Greenland up on places where there are glaciers now, or all the bodies they're finding uncovered in the ice in various places, or that when the rivers go down in Europe, they're finding what they call doomstones, where they carved on it the last time that there were droughts, extended droughts. The point is, climate's changed throughout history. It has been warmer in the past during this interglacial, not a million years ago, but during the last 12,000 years than it is now. That's what the evidence. We don't have data. We don't have temperature measurements from 6,000 years ago. What we do is have proxy data, and that data indicates it was warmer then than it is now. That all sorts of things, that there were mollusks on what is now hard land in Greenland, where there used to be an inland ocean. That trees were exposed that got covered, that bodies were exposed that got covered by ice during this interglacial. So it's been warmer before than it is now. And my suspicion is it will get warmer and cooler again until the next ice age comes.
Well, what kills me is that, we can't really measure today's temperature and have really much confidence in it. Yeah. Yet, we imagine we know what past temperature was, and then we imagine what future temperature will be. And even though future temperature hasn't happened yet, we call those predictions science, which they're not. The whole climate issue is crazy. I cannot believe I spent all this time on it.
Yeah. When I first started working on environmental issues and people wanted me to start working on climate, it's like, no, that's a fringe. That's a fringe thing. I've got more, endangered species and property issues are much bigger and more important. It's like, it's taken over our lives, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And and speaking of climate, because we're still going to be speaking about it, we do have a climate conference coming up. You want to tell people about it, Anthony?
Yeah, we're all going to be there. And this climate conference is going to be held in Orlando. And so if you want to get out of the extreme cold that has been plaguing much of the United States, go to Florida and be with us and get some of the most latest research and information about the so-called climate crisis, or is it just really a policy thing? But it's February 23rd to 25th in the Hilton Orlando Lake Buena Vista. Beautiful place. If you have never been there, I really encourage you to come. We're going to have some surprise announcements there. I'm going to have a surprise announcement there. Anyway, and I don't want to tip the scales right now and tell you about it, but some of the things that we've talked about here are going to be coming up in a surprise announcement. But I want to encourage you all to get on board and come to this conference. Right now, if you go to whatsupwiththat.com or go to climateconference.heartland.org, you can sign up early and get a special rate, not just for attending the conference, but also for the rooms at the Buena Vista Hotel, the Hilton there. And I really encourage you to do it. We're going to have a great time. We are going to show you how to fight this climate monster, so to speak, with facts. And so join us there.
Yeah, if you want to know, my thought is, if you want to know the true state of climate science and policy, this is where you should be, because we're going to have the top climate scientists there. We're also going to have some policymakers there speaking. We're going to have panels on ESG. We're going to have panels on impacts of climate policy on developing countries and the environment. If you want to know about these topics, this is the place to be.
I'm excited about the debate.
I'm sorry, and I didn't hear you. What did you say?
I said I'm excited about the debate that's going to be held on one of the panel or one of the keynote speeches.
Right. And you folks that couldn't watch us on YouTube last week because we got banned because we had a very prominent climate scientist on there, well, you might get to see that climate scientist again at this upcoming conference. So again, come visit us at this conference, February 23 to 25. Go to climateconference.heartland.org or whatsupwiththat.com and sign up while you can and get the special rate for the room and for the attendance. And I think that pretty well wraps up our show today. We've gone a little over an hour. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank you, those of you who are watching in particular, for having the courage to stand up and speak out against some of this insanity about climate. Your voice is important. Please keep it up. So for everyone here at the Heartland Institute, Linnea, Sterling, and our special guest, Steve, thanks again for visiting us, and stay warm.